Water is life, but in Johannesburg, life was running dry. Residents stood in long lines holding empty buckets, waiting for relief that never came. Schools shut down, hospitals rationed water, and families went days without a drop. As the taps ran dry, desperation set in across South Africa's biggest city. The city was on edge. People begged the government for answers, but officials blamed infrastructure and droughts. In this chaos, a major deal was quietly signed. Two young men, barely out of their teens, landed a 263 million rands tender to deliver water. But there was a problem. They didn't own a single water truck. This wasn't a regular business deal. It was an emergency contract meant to fix a crisis and save lives. Yet, somehow, the winners were two unknown companies that nobody had heard of. Their addresses led to empty buildings, and their promises were built on air. It didn't take long for people to ask, who are these guys? Their names weren't in business magazines. They had no websites. Their companies were missing from past projects or water delivery records. Still, they convinced the city they could handle the biggest water delivery job in Johannesburg's history. How? That's where this story begins. At first, people believed the city had found a solution. Tankers arrived, water was delivered to some areas, and officials praised the contractors. But something felt off. The tankers had no company logos, and many were rented or borrowed. Locals began to dig into the companies behind the trucks. The findings were shocking. The winning companies didn't own tankers. They didn't even have office buildings that matched their registration details. In fact, one address led to a locked house in a quiet suburb. Another was shared with a different company months before the tender even opened. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger it got. It turned out that these companies had no real assets. They relied on subcontractors and old business networks to operate. One of them was linked to a previous scandal involving water tenders in another province. Another had a director who was added just one day after the tender closed. Then he resigned quietly, right before the money started flowing. This wasn't just a fluke. It looked like a setup. A well-timed switch of directors, sudden address changes, and new business links all pointed to something bigger. These weren't just young men who got lucky. They had help, political help, business help, and maybe even help from inside the city government. Meanwhile, Johannesburg's water crisis only got worse. Communities still waited hours for water deliveries. Some tankers never showed up. Others brought dirty water or came days late. Complaints piled up, but the money kept flowing to the contractors. For every missed delivery, millions were still being paid out. People started asking hard questions. Why were these companies chosen? How did they beat nearly 90 other bidders? What did they promise that made them worth 263 million rands? The answers weren't clear, but the red flags were. Experts began to warn of serious fraud, and the media picked up the story. As pressure grew, the city refused to cancel the contract. They claimed the companies were delivering what was promised, but whistleblowers inside the department said otherwise. They claimed warnings were ignored, objections were silenced, and the final approval was rushed. What was meant to be a rescue turned into a scandal. And at the center of it all were two young businessmen, now millionaires in their 20s. With no real trucks, no experience, and no proper checks, they walked away with a deal that could feed a nation. How did they do it? Who let them in? And why was no one stopping them? In July 2023, Johannesburg Water faced one of its worst water shortages in years. The taps were dry across large parts of the city. People were lining up for water in buckets. Hospitals and schools were struggling. The government needed a fast solution. So, Johannesburg Water issued an emergency tender. The aim was to hire private companies that could deliver clean water using water tankers. The total value of this tender was 263 million rands. It was set to last for 3 years. It was supposed to help the city survive. 92 companies applied for the contract. Some were known businesses with good records. Others were new or had little public information. After reviewing the bids, 2 companies were chosen, Newton Ox and Built Pro Construction. Almost no one had heard of them before. Both companies claimed they had the skills and tools for the job. They promised to deliver thousands of liters of water every week. But there was one problem. Neither of them owned a single water tanker. That raised eyebrows. People wanted to know how they could do the job without the equipment. Newton Ox was registered to an address in Waterfall Estate, Midrand. The address sounded professional, but when investigators went there, they found it was not a working business. It was just an empty address. The company didn't even have a website. There were no signs that any employees worked there. Later, people found a second address for Newton Ox. It was a house in Rudeport. A resident there said they had nothing to do with the company. That made the situation even more confusing. Built Pro had its own strange address history. It was registered at 257 Oxford Road in Ilovo, but building security said Built Pro had moved out months earlier. Both companies had once shared the same address in Midrand. That made people wonder if they were connected. Johannesburg Water claimed the companies were separate, but there were no clear answers. No one could prove where they actually operated from. The tender was judged using a 90/10 scoring method. Most of the points, 90 out of 100, were based on price. The other 10 points were for things like location and black ownership. Newtonox and Built Pro scored high because of their BEE credentials and their listed locations. But their pricing wasn't simple. They charged very high rates for normal water delivery. That was strange because regular deliveries made up 90% of the job. Emergency deliveries made up only 10%, yet the companies offered very low prices for emergency work. That made their overall bid look cheaper when the two prices were combined. Critics said this was misleading. Neither Newtonox nor Built Pro had their own trucks. Instead, they planned to rent them. The trucks were to come from Astron Fleet. Astron Fleet was linked to the Niker family. This family had been connected to previous corruption cases. They had been accused of working with fake companies to win tenders and steal money. Because of this, people worried Newtonox and Built Pro were just middlemen. They would not deliver water themselves. They would just collect money while someone else did the work. That raised serious concerns. Some officials inside Johannesburg Water even said the contract cost 28% more than it should have. Even with all of this, the contract was signed in July 2024. That added more confusion. If the companies didn't meet the rules, why were they approved? Why did the city ignore cheaper and more qualified bids? One losing bidder, LTC Holdings, went to court. They said the tender process was unfair. They argued that the deadline had been illegally extended and that the lower bid had been ignored. The case is still in court. More questions are being asked every day. The Democratic Alliance also got involved. They pointed out that the winning companies didn't own any trucks. They asked for a full investigation. They wanted to know how these two mystery companies were trusted with millions of rands. The public still doesn't know the full story, but the facts that have come out so far are troubling. Two little-known businesses with no tankers, no websites, and shady addresses were given a huge contract during a crisis. The decisions made in this tender may have affected the lives of thousands of people across Johannesburg. When people began asking how two unknown companies won a 263 million rands tender, they looked first at Newtonox. At a glance, Newtonox looked impressive on paper, but when people dug deeper, everything started to fall apart. There was no official website, there were no records of past work. The company claimed to operate from a high-end estate in Midrand. Investigators visited the estate and found nothing that looked like a business. No staff, no trucks, no signs. It was just an address on paper, not a working office. It was clear Newtonox was not what it seemed. Then, investigators found another listed address for Newtonox in a place called Ritterput. They knocked on the door of the home. The man living there said he had never heard of Newtonox. He didn't know why his home was being used as a business address. This only deepened the mystery. Built Pro Construction had a similar story. It was supposed to be based in a building at 257 Oxford Road in Ilovo. That location sounded professional and businesslike, but when people checked, the company had already left the building months before. The address was just another empty trail. What made things stranger was their shared history. Newtonox and Built Pro had once operated from the same address in Midrand. That lasted until April 2023. After that, both companies listed different addresses. But the link between them was already there. It made people wonder if the two were secretly working together. The directors behind the companies were young. Newtonox was led by a 29-year-old man named Sibuyele. He was from the Eastern Cape and had no public business profile. Built Pro was headed by 27-year-old Emmanuel. He was also from the Eastern Cape. These were not seasoned business leaders. Both men had only handled small government jobs before. During the COVID-19 pandemic, they had won minor contracts in their home province. Those jobs were nothing like the massive water delivery tender they now held. It was a big jump, from small local work to a 263 million rands deal. That raised serious doubts. People wanted to know how two men in their 20s, with limited experience and no major business records, could win such a huge tender. Their companies had no trucks, no staff, and no proof of past success. The only thing they seemed to have was paperwork. That wasn't enough to deliver clean water to a city. Journalists tried to reach both directors. They wanted answers about the company setup and the tender process, but there were no public interviews, no press releases, no signs of real operations. It was silent. For companies handling emergency water in a major city, the silence was suspicious. The more people looked, the more strange things they found. Newton Knox and Built Pro didn't have any presence online. No photos of tankers, no updates about deliveries, no communication with the public. Even companies that do small jobs usually post something. But these two had nothing. There were also no visible offices or employees, no team handling logistics, no field managers tracking deliveries, no sign of where their money was going or how they were spending it. 263 million rands was in their hands, but no one could see the work being done. City officials tried to defend the deal. They said the companies had met the tender rules. They claimed everything had been checked. But when the addresses didn't match and the trucks didn't exist, their answers stopped making sense. Something wasn't right. People began asking if the tender had been rigged. Was it possible that these two young men were just faces on a contract? Was someone else really behind the companies? Were these businesses set up just to win tenders and collect money without doing the real work? Those questions kept piling up. The facts didn't add up. Two young men with weak business records had won a massive deal in a city that desperately needed help, and yet no one could explain how. No one could show how the work would be done. The truth behind Newton Knox and Built Pro remained hidden, at least for now. The more investigators dug into Newton Knox and Built Pro, the more tangled the story became. It wasn't just about young entrepreneurs with questionable businesses. It was also about powerful connections in the world of politics and business. These connections seemed to go far beyond the two men running the companies. One such link was with a man named Tempiel, whose involvement raised eyebrows. Tempiel was not just any businessman. He was the president of the South African National Military Veterans Association and had a history with Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the armed wing of the African National Congress. On September 1st, 2023, just a day after the tender closed, Tempiel became a director at Newton Knox. It seemed like an odd move, considering the company had no track record. Why would someone with such a high political profile get involved with a company that was barely more than a name on paper? Tempiel's time with Newton Knox didn't last long, just 3 months. Before the contract was awarded, he quietly resigned. Why would he leave so soon, especially when the company stood to gain millions in government contracts? The timing of his resignation only fueled suspicions. Some believed he was brought in to give the company political credibility, a way to ensure that the tender process went smoothly. His quick exit seemed like a calculated move: join for a short while, make the connections needed, and then step away before things got too complicated. This brief but significant involvement raised questions about the true nature of Newton Knox's operations and who was really pulling the strings behind the scenes. As the investigation continued, another connection came to light that deepened the mystery. Newton Knox and Built Pro were both planning to lease water tankers from a company called Astron Fleet. On the surface, Astron Fleet seemed like a legitimate business that could provide the necessary equipment for water delivery. But there was more to Astron Fleet than met the eye. Astron Fleet was a spin-off of Aqua Transport and Plant Hire, a company with a much darker history. Aqua Transport had been severed from Johannesburg Water in 2021 after being linked to corruption scandals. Investigators had uncovered that Aqua was involved in shady deals, and as a result, Johannesburg Water had cut ties. Aqua Transport's owner, Kevin Nyka, had been at the center of this corruption. But even after Aqua was blacklisted, Kevin Nyka's business empire continued to thrive through his brother, Donovan Nyka. Donovan controlled Astron Fleet, the company that Newton Knox and Built Pro hoped to lease water tankers from. The connection between the Nyka brothers and the two companies was more than just business. The Nykas had a history of being involved with government tenders, raising suspicions about how they managed to stay afloat despite being linked to corruption. The involvement of Donovan Nyka in Astron Fleet meant that Newton Knox and Built Pro were potentially tied to the very corruption that Johannesburg Water had tried to distance itself from. The Nykas were no strangers to the tender process, and their influence in the world of water delivery was a known fact. When investigators uncovered the ties between Newton Knox, Built Pro, and Astron Fleet, it painted a clear picture of a network of political and business interests working behind the scenes. It was becoming clearer that the young entrepreneurs weren't acting alone. Their rapid rise in the tender world seemed less like a stroke of luck and more like the result of well-placed connections. Tempiel's brief involvement in Newton Knox, followed by the links to the Nykas and their shady past, made it hard to believe that Newton Knox and Built Pro were just two innocent companies. It seemed that this was a game of power and influence, with these young men merely acting as fronts for deeper, more powerful forces. Was the contract truly earned through fair competition? Or had it been orchestrated behind closed doors with the help of political ties and business connections? The involvement of people like Tempiel, who had ties to MK and the Military Veterans Association, only added to the complexity of the story. The Nikas, who had been involved in previous scandals, now had another hand in the tender game. With each connection that surfaced, it became harder to ignore the possibility that the system had been manipulated. People started to wonder if this was simply a case of young entrepreneurs getting lucky, or if something far more sinister was at play. The combination of political ties and business connections made it clear that Newton Knox and BuiltPro weren't just small-time players, they were part of something much larger. And as the investigation continued, it became evident that the truth about the 263 million rands contract was far more complicated than anyone had initially thought. The controversy surrounding the tender continued to escalate as the public learned more about the questionable awarding of the contract. Johannesburg Water, responsible for managing the city's water supply, had used a 90/10 scoring system to evaluate bids. While the system seemed straightforward, the way it was applied raised serious concerns. The 90 points allocated to the price were supposed to prioritize cost effectiveness, but this left little room for evaluating the actual capacity of the companies to deliver on their promises. Newton Knox and BuiltPro had claimed to be based in Gauteng, and they had emphasized their black ownership, which earned them additional points under the tender's criteria. Despite these claims, there were immediate red flags. The two companies had low emergency rates, which on paper made them appear as cost-effective options. However, the truth was much murkier. They had much higher rates for regular deliveries, which seemed to contradict their supposed budget-friendly pricing. These inconsistencies raised questions about whether the tender process had been manipulated to benefit the two companies, or if the system had simply failed to account for real-world delivery capabilities. But even with these warning signs, the contract was still awarded, much to the dismay of many within Johannesburg Water itself. Internal opposition to the deal surfaced quickly as concerns about the tender's legitimacy grew. The general manager of finance at Johannesburg Water was one of the first to voice objections, pointing out a glaring issue. The tender had come in 28% over budget, compared to the initial estimates. This significant overrun should have raised alarms for anyone involved in the decision-making process, but it didn't. The higher-than-expected costs, especially given the company's lack of proper resources, made it clear that the city's water crisis was being compounded by poor financial decisions. The fact that an internal manager had raised such strong concerns only added fuel to the fire, leading many to question the integrity of the entire bidding process. In the aftermath of the contract's award, a competing bidder, LTC Holdings, filed a legal challenge, further complicating the situation. LTC argued that the tender extension, which had increased from an initial 90 days to 241 days, was improper and violated the terms of the contract. This extension was seen as a critical flaw in the process. If the contract terms were not followed properly, it could result in the entire tender being invalidated. The court hearings were expected to have significant consequences, not just for the companies involved, but for the future of Johannesburg's water delivery services. The outcome of these hearings could determine whether Newton Knox and BuiltPro would keep their lucrative contract or if a new bidder would take their place. As the legal battles unfolded, the public's frustration grew. For many residents of Johannesburg, the water crisis was no longer just about the availability of water, it was about trust. The city had already been grappling with severe water shortages, and the situation only worsened as the tender drama continued. People began to wonder if the two companies were even capable of fulfilling the massive task they had been given. After all, neither Newton Knox nor BuiltPro owned a single water tanker, yet they had promised to deliver millions of liters of water. Without the necessary equipment, how could they possibly meet the needs of a city facing an urgent crisis? The skepticism was not limited to the residents. It was shared by experts in the water delivery industry. Many questioned how the companies could manage such large-scale operations without the proper infrastructure. The growing public outcry was impossible to ignore. People took to social media to voice their anger and disbelief at how the tender process had been handled. As the legal case continued and the companies struggled to deliver on their promises, it became clear that this was not just a story of poor business practices, it was a tale of betrayal. The residents of Johannesburg, already enduring the hardship of water shortages, were now left to wonder whether their leaders had sold them out for profit. And with each passing day, the situation only seemed to get worse. The city's water crisis was now intertwined with questions of corruption, incompetence, and political influence, leaving everyone to ask, who was really responsible for this disaster? Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.